William is one of our best, longest serving dedicated member. This is his second presentation in our conferences. Second or third? Second. He has been very active in this community. He has helped build it. He has helped send the word out. Now he's one of, we just, as I told you early in the morning, we are shipping out developers from here. Good developers, of course, and William is one of them. Right now he's based in Berlin, Germany. And we are so proud of him, and he's going to talk about a very interesting topic. This is exploring Docker for Rubyists on Windows. So those of you who have ever developed on Windows using Ruby, you know how it is, isn't it? So he'll show you, he'll talk about that. You can follow him at Wanyama_man on Twitter, and he works for Clockner.ai. So William is a software engineer at Clockner.ai in Berlin and a passionate, although remote, member of the Nairobi scene, having spent a couple of years in Nairobi hustling and bustling with his own tech startup. He now likes to mentor and give back to other upcoming Ruby entrepreneurs in the region. Give it up for William Wanyama.
Thank you for the introduction. As you said, my name is William Wanyama. Yeah, you can help me? Cool. And I am a senior software engineer based in Berlin now. I'm a long-term member of this community, and I'm happy to be back. I try and give back as much as I can, and which is why I was inspired to give this talk today. Last year I talked about something about contributing to open source, which was more theoretical. This year I thought, let me try and give you something practical that you could try and implement in the ecosystem here. And so I picked on one of the biggest pains I've seen here is when we hold workshops. It's a bit of a challenge to get everyone up and running in one day to try out Rails. And so that's usually because a lot of people will come in as newcomers, mainly using Windows. And so I love Docker, and I thought, well, there has to be a Docker way to make this easier for everyone, right? Ooh, do I have to press down? So what's the actual problem we're looking at here? Well, Windows has been historically challenging to do any Ruby development there. You can set it up, but if you try and do any customization, change your Rails path, you run into a whole host of issues. And this has been a big pain when I attend workshops here, because then I spend most of the time in the workshop trying to help people who their Windows systems are failing, while others who are on Linux systems get up and going. And so, is this something that Docker could help us with? Maybe, maybe not. I thought maybe let's try and come up with a plausible use case and see if Docker can be something usable for the community. And the use case I used is Rails Girls Nairobi. There's a workshop tomorrow, by the way. If you feel like joining, you don't have to be female. It's welcome for all members. You can come and teach. If you identify as a female, you're also welcome. Everyone is welcome to come to the workshop and help. And so the kind of setup we have in these Rails Girls workshops is you generally have a team of moderators who set up what the workshop is about, and then you have your audience, which come with a whole mix of laptops, Linux-based, Windows-based. And there's two main challenges: one, to get Ruby up and running on the Windows laptops, as well as network problems. Because as you've all experienced with the network that we have today here, because it's a large audience, it's a bit slow. And now imagine trying to bundle install in a group. Try and imagine setting all of that up in a day to get up and running. So these are challenges that I thought, well, maybe we can avoid the frustration of just simply having to set up our tools. Especially for newcomers, you don't want to scare them with, oh, it's such a pain to get up and running with development, I don't want to do this. Can we do better? That was my question. And this talk explores the fact that with Docker, possibly, it offers us an alternative way of setting up Rails and getting up and going. Docker offers an environment sandbox, and what that basically means is, regardless of what operating system you're running on, you can run your application in this sandbox where it's unaware of your operating system at large, and then you can get consistent behavior in different environments. And so sounds cool, right? Maybe this will solve a problem. Can we run applications the same way we run in Linux, the same way we run on Windows? Maybe. And if you've been following Docker development, Docker started becoming popular for Linux developers as of late 2016, when it started supporting native Linux containers on Windows. And now, as of this year, I've not kept up with what's happening right now, but at the beginning of this year, Windows was happy to announce that we have now native containers that can run a lot of Linux systems on Windows. So the big promise with Docker is you just install once and you can run anything anywhere. But what exactly is Docker? By the way, my slides are inspired by the Mara, for those of you who are going to go on the Mara, the Masai Mara drive this coming weekend. The only disclaimer is the whale. I don't think you can find that in the Mara. Don't hold me accountable for that. But it's a Docker image. And so Docker is an open source technology, like I said. Also, I think Brian shared a bit about Docker earlier on in his talk. It's the most popular open source container technology that we have right now. And you basically have two things that you work with. You have your Docker file, which is your recipe to describe the needs of your application. And then you have images and containers, which are runnable instances of your application based on the image, which is all your binaries and executables. But I'll go into this in more detail. Now it's time for some Docker mambo jumbo. This is where, if you're familiar with Docker, this is basic stuff. If you're new to Docker, then I hope I can give you some insight into what happens within a Docker, what's happening in Docker and what Docker is all about. Like I said, there's three main components: Docker file, image, and container. I thought let's start with the end, the container. The container is your program actually living and running. If you think about it, right now I have multiple windows or sessions of the Chrome browser, and they're all independent of each other. I can close one, doesn't affect the other. This is the same concept with the Docker container. You have a running instance of your application that you can shoot up as many as you want, take them down. They don't really interfere with each other, which is fantastic, because if there's one with a bug, take it down, spin up another one. But how do you spin up a Docker container? Well, Docker containers are spun up from images. Images are all the application binaries and executables that are needed to run your application. So if you think about it, if you install a program on your laptop, you have binaries and libraries that are there, and then you usually click a application icon and you get a running instance. An image is something similar to that. It's your application binaries that are static, they're not doing anything, and if you get Docker to run them, they spin up a container, which is your running instance. But how does Docker know how to aggregate the application dependencies that you need? You do that by providing it a Docker file, which then is your recipe book of what exactly your application needs to get up and running. And so these are the interesting things we want to play around with. We want to play around with Docker files to specify a basic Rails environment and setup that we can get up and running in a workshop, and try and leverage some of the Docker benefits to see if we can mitigate the network connectivity problems, as well as reducing the barrier to entry for newcomers. To put all of that in a different way, you can imagine Docker as an oven. Your Docker file is your recipe book. From your recipe book, you can get, this is where I cheat, you can get an unlimited supply of ingredients. Those are your Docker images. And with this unlimited supply of ingredients, feed it to Docker in the oven, it spins up cake for you. Those are your containers, and you can spin up as many as you want because we have unlimited supply of ingredients. So I hope that gives you a better idea of what the Docker world is all about, and the three main components that help us in Docker. So back to Windows. Docker's fantastic on Linux environments. How about Windows? What are our options? Turns out there's two flavors of installing Docker on Windows. There's Docker for Windows, which is the more modern and recommended version of the Docker installation tools for Windows. And there's Docker Toolbox, which is the more traditional old Docker executable for setting up, executable on Windows for setting up Docker. For this talk, I'm going to go with Docker Toolbox, simply because let's keep in mind the use case that I'm using, which is Rails Girls Nairobi. And as you can see, when you compare the two, Docker Toolbox supports Windows 7, 8, and Windows 10 Home Edition. These are the most common Windows environments I encountered when I was in these workshops, as compared to Docker for Windows, which has better features, better support, but it has higher requirements and a higher barrier to entry in terms of operating system. You need Windows 10 Pro Edition or Enterprise Edition. One interesting thing to note is because Docker Toolbox is more ancient, it actually cheats and spins up a virtual machine underneath the hood to run Docker in a Linux environment. So you're not really getting the power of Windows. There's no native support there from Windows, which is what has changed for Docker for Windows, which now natively uses Windows containers. So we are sort of deviating from what the best practice is today, but it's more specifically tailored to our use case. When you download Docker Toolbox, it essentially installs 3 things for you. The most important that you need to care about is Docker Quick Start Terminal. As you can see on the top right-hand there, we've got 3 icons that come with Docker Toolbox. It installs Docker Quick Start Terminal, a virtual machine there using VirtualBox, and Kinematic, which I didn't even try using. I don't know what that's for. You can play around with it. But essentially, we only care about Docker Quick Start. Why? Because if you open up a terminal once you've installed Docker, then you still need to get Docker connected to your terminal and set up a lot of basic things. What's fantastic about Docker Quick Start Terminal is it sets up Docker for you, connects it to your terminal, and boom, Docker Compose, Docker commands all run straight from your terminal. Perfect, easy for beginners. You also have to bear in mind you need to install Git if you want to do any Git-related work. But Docker Toolbox will also offer you that option to install Git additionally. So if we have that up and running, it's probably time to start thinking about Rails development, right? And don't worry about the specifics of this. If you're not familiar with Docker, it's just there to show you for example reasons. This is a basic recommended Rails Docker file from the Docker documentation, Docker docs. And the only thing you need to notice is this is our script when I was giving the description of what three basic components of Docker are. This is our recipe to make our image and essentially get Rails up and running. And as you can see from line 1, we're building it from a Ruby image. And one other key element you can look at is line 7, which is we have bundle install running there. And if you think about our network restraints, if everyone needs to set up Docker on their machines and they're running bundle install, this is going to be a pain. There's an extra component to Docker called Docker Compose. And you don't need to know about this too much. It's a very useful tool if you want to start multiple services or containers that interact with each other. So if you think about Rails, you generally want to start Rails with a database server. So Postgres, or any flavor that you like. And what Docker Compose does is it makes it easier for you to have all these setup containers running and communicating quite easily. And this is an example of a Docker Compose file that we can use for a workshop to just get a basic Postgres and Rails setup running. So now back to our use case. If we use that Docker file, we can build a Docker image that's only available on one machine. As you can see there, the moderator, I could have done this ways before my workshop, set up my Docker file, built my image, great. I have Docker and Rails running on my machine. How do I share this and distribute it with the rest of the audience? I need everyone to be on the same page. This is where Docker registries come into play. But what are Docker registries? Well, if you think about it, when I build an image based on the requirements for my application, it's only available on my machine. And Docker has a registry hub called Docker Hub, which is available at hub.docker.com, What this is similar to is like GitHub. I can produce code, share it up there, and anyone can pull it down and run my application. Docker Hub is the same. I can build an image specific to my application needs. Let's say I need Elasticsearch, etc., for a very specific application use case, and I came up with a Docker file that solves that, and I want to share it with you. I can publish my image, and you can pull it down. Don't need to worry about what the requirements are to get that specific application running, and you can easily distribute this. But the only problem is, again, this is on the internet. We don't want solutions that need us to pull or download anything from the internet for our workshop. Yeah, like I mentioned, it's going to be painfully slow. We don't want this. Docker offers another alternative. Instead of pushing our images to the cloud and storing them in Docker Hub, you can actually set up a local registry on your own machine. So as the moderator, I can have the image running live on my machine, and the only catch is then, how do I share this with the rest of the group, right? We have the situation at the moment. I can set up a registry on my machine, host my image there, pull it, make changes, update it, refine it, get it perfect, but the rest of the audience is still disconnected from me. This is just the code that you need to get your Docker registry set up locally. I decided not to do a demo because those can go weird in terms of your network connection on the day, so you'll have to make do with some copy pasting of code here. But the only thing I want to highlight is what's highlighted in whatever that color is. I don't know, I'm colorblind right now. But it's highlighting the word IP. Where with all the sections that are highlighted, you would need to substitute that with the IP address of your machine on the local network. So this is one thing that you'd have to change per workshop that you do. You'd have to find out what your local IP is and set it up to get your registry available on the local network. Docker goes a step further and gives us superpowers. If I have a registry on my machine, I can actually distribute this to the audience and let them have access to my local registry, which, if you connect the dots, means we don't ever need to ever go to the internet and to the cloud. We can all do our downloads locally and be capped by the local area network capacity. And so this is the perfect scenario that we want. We want to be able to create our Docker registry locally on our machine as the moderator, way ahead of the workshop, get it perfect, and then be able to share it with everyone in the audience that's running Docker. But in order for Docker to access a local registry, there are some restrictions. There are some gotchas. And that is, Docker will only pull images from a trusted source. If you host it locally, Docker will not trust that source. You have alternative options, which are, you need to get a certification that Docker can then trust. You could do this by having a domain, but then that makes us go back to the internet, which you don't want. Or you can create your own self-signed certificate and have that local on your machine. It's different on both Linux and on Windows, and this is probably the trickiest part of the whole setup, to just get your certificate self-signed and locally available, because you have to do this on every single machine. But it's something that's repeatable, and once you do it once, then you know how to do it on Windows or Linux. But if we have our certificate at hand, Docker can then trust the certificate and allow you to pull images from that source. The only gotcha here is it's a huge security risk. You open yourself up to be prone to man-in-the-middle attacks. You need to be careful about this. Never try and use local Docker registries for production purposes or any sensitive information. That's a disclaimer. And so our command would change and be a bit longer, but basically there we have an instruction telling Docker, please run this image for me locally, given the certificate, and let it be accessible on the network for anyone to pull it down. And so with that set up, we have everyone happy. We have a registry that's local. I can set it up weeks in advance. I can reuse it in any workshop, and all I have to do is just know my IP address in the local network, share it with everyone, and they can copy paste the Docker commands as long as they've set up Docker, quick and easy with Docker Toolbox, and then be able to pull down my image and have everything that they need for Rails development while escaping the whole Windows nightmare. You could also go crazy and make your Docker image a Windows image and solve all these problems yourself and then share that, but that's madness. But now we're in a good place. Everyone is connected. Everyone is able to pull down Rails and get it up and running. Like I mentioned, there are a few gotchas you need to be aware of. One of those is you need to, for each Docker machine, you need to go there and allow it to trust this self-send certificate. That can be also scary for newcomers. It's a lot of technical stuff, but a lot of it can be copy and pasted, and there are a lot of good tutorials out there. There's one on HackerNoon that I shared in one of my previous slides. You can have a look at that. You need to also be aware, normally if you on Linux and you spin up a Docker container and you want to access Rails, it'll be localhost and then your port. On Windows, you don't use localhost. You have to specify the IP, but that's given to you when you start Docker, quick start, when you run your Docker using quick start terminal. It spins back the IP that Docker is available on your machine. You also have issues where if you want to use any volumes, then they need to be stored in a specific location. That's your C drive / users. Anywhere else, it gets kind of hairy and scary, and you don't want to go there. And yeah, lastly, if your IP address keep changing for any reasons, sort of, if you're using a DNS locally, then you will need to keep track of these IP addresses. Those are essentially the pain points. So the question is, if we have this up and running, given all these requirements, is this really better? I don't know. We can look at some of the pros and cons. The positive things is we have Docker running on everyone's machine using Docker Quick Start, which is quite simple to get up and going. It's a simple click, follow, next, 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 next. Agree terms and conditions, please read them, finish. But yeah, with that basically set up, then you only need to do your self-signed certificate stuff, and that's it. You can pull down Rails images. It opens you to a whole world of other environments that are limited on Windows, not just Rails and Ruby. It's much faster if you set it up locally. You can now take advantage of your local network capacity instead of having to sit and wait for images to be pulled down, which can be quite slow. It's also distributable, it's scalable, and Docker is super flexible. There's so much you can do with it, and this is just the basic setup. You can go crazy if you have any data that you want to share on your local network. Say you want images for your Rails app for your workshop. You can store this in one machine, have it available on the network, and have that as a volume. And so everyone who's using your image then has only one source of data. You don't need to download anything from the internet anymore. The cons, though, like I said, Docker is quite strict on requirements. You do need, I don't know how much RAM you need, but it's quite high. And you also need to have some Docker expertise in the team, which I entrust as the moderator, you take the time out to learn how to do this yourself. You also need some network expertise to solve IP problems if you have anything like that. And like I said, running a local registry is a huge security risk. You have to be careful with what you're doing. Don't ever try and use this in production. And it can get super complicated if you try and do any more fancy stuff. But that's the beauty of Docker. It's the same on Linux as well. If you want to have a crazy architecture, you have to then take in the pain points of Docker and setting up and having everything communicating well. At the end of the day, all I say is this is an alternative route. If you've been painfully installing Rails on Windows and sick and tired of all the bugs that you run into, well, this is just an alternative you could look into. There's Rails installer as well on Windows that sets everything up and running. As long as at the end of the day for you, you remember why Ruby as a community is loved, and that is because Ruby ensures programmer happiness. And I hope with this, what I've shown you today can help you discover your own programmer happiness for Windows environments. Thank you.